Hey everyone, this is the conclusion to John E. Kelly's The Twilight of World Trotskyism, and the conclusion is just titled The Twilight of World Trotskyism. So, let's rock. Writing about the links between periods of class struggle and the growth of Marxist influence, British Socialist Workers' Party leader Alex Kallinikos recently noted the existence of four historic rendezvous between Marxism and the workers' movement: the formation of social democratic parties in the 1870s, the 1917 Russian Revolution, the national liberation struggles of the 1950s, and the world strike wave beginning in 1968. Klinikos, 2010. 2021. Jesus Christ. The last of these encounters was particularly beneficial to world Trotskyism, as we have seen, but during the past half-century there has been no further, quote, rendezvous between the workers' movement and Trotskyism, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European communist states. The continuing decline of communist parties around the world and multiple waves of social protests on every continent. If this historical timeline suggests the problems of Trotskyism are comparatively recent, the implication is misleading, and it is worth recalling the points that open this book. Trotskyists have not led a revolutionary struggle for power in any country. Trotskyists have never won a national election, and Trotskyists have never built an enduring mass party anywhere at any time. For the most part, the Trotskyist movement is organizationally small, politically irrelevant, and deeply fragmented. The largest organizations exist in countries that are home to at least 10 Trotskyist groups: Argentina, Brazil, Britain, France, Germany, Mexico, Spain, and the USA, whilst the number of Fourth Internationals now stands at 32. For a movement that was officially launched in 1938 with such high hopes, the results of almost a century of sustained political activity are utterly dismal. Back in the 1920s, Trotsky and his supporters began to fight an increasingly desperate struggle against the Stalinist leadership of the Soviet Union and its Communist Party affiliates around the world. Subject everywhere to hostility and repression, tiny Trotskyist groups slowly began to emerge in the 1930s and to carve out a precarious existence. During the bleak years of the post-war era, some of them worked as small factions inside larger mainstream parties as in Argentina and Britain, whilst others operated as independent but tiny groups on the fringes of political life, e.g. France and the United States. It was the economic and political conjunctures of the 1960s and 1970s, slowing economic growth, declining profit rates, stagflation, anti-Vietnam War protests, and the world strike wave that transformed the small isolated circles of Trotskyist supporters into groups with hundreds, occasionally a few thousand members, and with footholds in a few trade unions and social movements. This, quote, golden age, end quote, of Trotskyism was delayed for a decade or more in Latin America until the pervasive military dictatorships were eventually swept away. Argentinian Trotskyism, for example, flourished through the 1980s, whilst the Trotskyist tide in Europe and the USA was already starting to recede alongside declining strike activity, economic recession, and deindustrialization. Membership decline and the ensuing debates about, quote, missed opportunities, end quote, and tactical and strategic orientations generated waves of splits in a movement long known for its fissiparous tendencies, tendencies towards fissure and splitting. Decline and disintegration hit the British and American movements with particular ferocity in the 1980s and early 1990s, whilst the stronger movements in Latin America, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Mexico succumbed to similar processes of fragmentation and decline from the 1990s. French Trotskyism appeared to buck the trend of decline, and some observers even believed, wrongly as it turned out, that the 2009 formation of the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste, NPA, the new anti-capitalist party, would inaugurate a new period of political advance. Many Trotskyist parties experienced a period of relative stability through the early years of the 21st century, but this soon came to an end as a renewed cycle of splits and decline gathered momentum, starting with the rapid and dramatic decline of the new anti-capitalist party and the split of the POI in France. And continuing with major schisms in the Argentinian PO, the British Socialist Party and its international apparent, the CWI, and the dissolution of the American ISO. Jesus Christ. This recent wave of splits and membership losses means that a movement which began almost a century ago as the self-proclaimed and exclusive standard-bearer of Bolshevik doctrine and tradition now finds itself beleaguered, fractured, and marginal. Back in the early 1960s, the travails of the Trotskyist movement largely stemmed from the hegemonic positions of its communist and social democratic party rivals, the dynamism of world capitalism, and the relative quiescence of the working class, developments quite contrary to Trotsky's 1938 analysis in the Transitional Program, which is on this channel. But the current state of the movement follows a historical period starting in the 1980s that should, on any estimate, have proved to be unusually propitious. The global rise of neoliberalism and economic austerity, the surge in income and wealth inequality, the progressive dismantling of labor market protections, the rise of the gig economy, cuts to welfare, pensions and public housing, multiple cycles of general strikes and social movement protests around the world, particularly in Europe, North Africa, and Latin America, the continuing decline of the world's communist parties, and new wars of foreign intervention, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq. Despite its involvement in many of the strikes, protests, and social movements of the last 30 years, there is no country in the world in which Trotskyism has emerged as a powerful, nationally significant mass political force. Membership levels are tiny, with the world's largest groups such as the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain or Lutte Ouvrière in France, numbering no more than a few thousand, whilst the average Trotskyist group comprises a few hundred or even fewer. Hundreds of electoral campaigns fought over many years in almost 40 countries have repeatedly and consistently generated vote shares of less than 1%, confirming the widespread unpopularity of Trotskyist programs and policies and the marginality of Trotskyist parties. Yet the significant votes for radical left and green parties over the past 40 years show there is a substantial electoral constituency to the left of mainstream social democracy for whom Trotskyism has practically no appeal. The reasons often advanced by Trotskyists themselves for their own weaknesses are unconvincing, mainly revolving around the hegemony of reformist ideas disseminated and reinforced by communist and social democratic parties and more recently by radical left parties. This consoling narrative simply fails to address the most obvious question: why have the ideas of numerous Trotskyist groups with varying interpretations of Trotskyist doctrine failed to appeal to large numbers of working class supporters at any time in any country in the world? The argument of this book is that the weakness and failings of the Trotskyist movement stem principally from its largely uncritical attachment to a body of doctrine that has proved repeatedly to be irrelevant and unpopular. Broadly speaking, it can be summed up under the following headings: the theory of permanent revolution, the united front tactic, transitional demands, a democratic centralist revolutionary vanguard party, a new revolutionary leadership, the Fourth International, rank-and-file movements in the trade unions, critical analysis of Stalinism and the Stalinist states, revolutionary seizure of power, and the idea of the imperialist epoch as one of wars and revolutions. Much of the Trotskyist movement has been assiduous in its attachment to these elements of doctrine and correspondingly hostile to their critics. The movement has, of course, been racked by disputes over the interpretation and application of different facets of doctrine and by differing estimates of the relative importance of its various elements. Whilst attachment to doctrine allows Trotskyist groups to boast of their historical continuity with the perspectives and program of the original 1938 Fourth International, it is simultaneously the source of their fundamental weakness. Their beliefs in, quote, the actuality of the revolution, end quote, Lukács, The irrelevance of parliamentary democracy and the key role of a workers' insurgency led by a centralized vanguard party of Trotskyist militants have never appealed to more than a tiny minority of people. Trotskyists seem undeterred by the fact that no parliamentary democracy has ever been overthrown in a workers' revolution because their doctrine stipulates this is the only way to achieve any significant and enduring change in the interest of working people. It is Trotskyist doctrine that has positioned the movement as largely irrelevant to the concerns and beliefs of the overwhelming majority of citizens and voters. The widespread claim that, quote, reforms are impossible, end quote, and that the actual choice facing people today is, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote, are powerful echoes of Trotsky's doom-laden prognoses of the late 1930s, that world capitalism had exhausted its economic potential and could preserve itself only by wholesale attacks on the living conditions of the vast majority of people. Actual reforms, whether in women's rights, civil liberties, democratization, etc., enacted in numerous countries over many decades, are often dismissed as marginal concessions or described as forlorn attempts to prolong an outmoded economic and political system. Sometimes they are explained as the results of class struggles and protests, but such actions are normal features of liberal democracies, not harbingers of revolutionary or pre-revolutionary situations. If the gap between the claims of Trotskyist groups and the lived experience of millions of people is substantial, the apocalyptic mantra of, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote, opens up an unbridgeable chasm. A similar problem applies to the Trotskyist dismissal of parliamentary politics, a viewpoint that reflects its doctrinaire and uncritical adherence to Lenin's intemperate and ill-informed 1917 tract State and Revolution. The fact that no revolution has ever been launched against a functioning parliamentary democracy suggests to most observers that such a political institution enjoys widespread popular support, particularly when compared to the alternatives defended by Trotskyists as viable alternatives, whether it be the early Russian Soviets or the authoritarian and repressive regimes of China, Cuba, or Venezuela. Most, though not all, Trotskyists see no prospect of achieving power through parliamentary elections, believing instead that it is cycles of class struggle that will help develop revolutionary class consciousness, weaken and divide the ruling class, and usher in a situation of, quote, dual power, so that the now thriving mass Trotskyist party can launch a revolutionary struggle for power. Let us leave aside for a moment the awkward fact that in most countries there are numerous Trotskyist organizations which believe they, and they alone, are destined to inherit the mantle of Lenin's Bolsheviks. This basic revolutionary scenario sketched out in many Trotskyist publications is crude and unrealistic. In the first place, there is a common conflation of many different types of event, whether protest, rebellion, revolt, insurgency, or revolution. Moreover, the links between the demands, tactics, actions, and alliances in strikes and other social movement protests and their social, economic, and political outcomes display a level of complexity way beyond the simple nostrums of Trotskyist writings. Lacking any appreciation of these complexities and subtleties leads Trotskyist reflections on such events into two characteristic errors: self-righteous anger at the, quote, betrayals, end quote, enacted by Stalinists, social democrats, liberals, and other opportunistic or ultra-left Trotskyists, and wishful thinking about, quote, what might have been, end quote, if only there had been a mass revolutionary party able to challenge non-revolutionary forces and lead the masses to their historic destiny. Why their own organizations have never achieved this status in the throes of countless struggles and protests is a mystery to Trotskyists whose incomprehension can only culminate in idle speculation and mournful lamentation. Some Trotskyist groups and internationals have pursued a more indirect route to political hegemony, working as factions inside radical left parties such as Die Linke and Partido Socialismo e Libertad, PSOL. But they have enjoyed as little success as the numerous small independent Trotskyist parties, each aspiring to become the vanguard party of the working class. Equally damaging to the Trotskyist cause is the legacy which they seek to defend, that of Lenin and Trotsky's, quote, authentic revolutionary socialism, end quote, against the bureaucratic and murderous counter-revolutionary politics of Stalin. For Trotskyists, it is self-evident that their own legacy is superior to that of the Stalinist communist parties, but the troubling thought that both traditions are unacceptable and irrelevant for most people is too heretical to contemplate. And for all the talk of a chasm Between Trotskyism and Stalinism, many Trotskyist organizations still offer a, quote, critical defense of, end quote, of the world's few remaining Stalinist outposts, particularly the authoritarian and repressive one-party regimes of Cuba and China, describing them as, quote, degenerated worker states, end quote. Groups that belong to or emerge from the, quote, third camp, end quote, tradition, such as the Alliance for Workers' Liberty and the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain, are exceptions to this stricture, but their escape from the orbits of mainstream orthodox and Latin American Trotskyism comes at a price as they seek to defend a policy of socialist revolution which, by their own admission, has failed everywhere it has been tried. In short, the weaknesses and failures of the Trotskyist movement are neither conjunctural nor episodic, nor are they primarily the result of mistaken choices, poor leadership, or unforeseeably adverse circumstances. There have been poor leaders, vain, arrogant, and authoritarian, and bad choices of tactics and strategy have been pursued on many occasions. But the failings of Trotskyism transcend these problems and are chronic, persistent, and pervasive because they are rooted in an inflexible attachment to an outmoded and irrelevant doctrine and sectarian hostility to those who disagree, not least other Trotskyists. Ian Birchall, I'm actually reading a book by Ian Birchall because he wrote a biography of the Socialist Workers' Party. I want to look something up real quick. Bookmarks publication put out Birchall's book about Cliff, and I think Bookmarks is affiliated with okay, no, they're still publishing his books. Okay. Or they still carry his books, at least the bookshop does. But yeah, I had trouble trying to find it. But I found like a PDF online. But they're not carrying his book on Tony Cliff, which is interesting. Let me look that up one more time. Sorry, I know this is annoying, but I'm just curious. Yeah, I don't see it. It's on Internet Archive, but I'm not seeing anything from Bookmarks publication. But Ian Birchall, anyway, back to the text. Ian Birchall, a veteran ex-member of the British Socialist Workers' Party, recently remarked, quote, "There's still much to learn from Trotsky, but, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, is dead," end quote. Birchall, 2019. Leaving aside the question of what, if anything, can be learned from reading Trotsky, Birchall's prognosis for Trotskyism is surely right. In the early 1980s, Birchall's former Socialist Workers' Party comrade Alex Kalinikos declared that the continuation of British capitalism after 80 years of Labour Party activity included 5 Labour governments pointed to an inexorable conclusion. Quote, "The Labour Party is a dead end for socialists, ... It's time to look for an alternative," end quote. After more than 80 years of Trotskyist activity, with no revolutions, mass parties, or election victories to its name, the same logic surely suggests that the Trotskyist movement has become a dead end for socialists. I'm curious where Birchall said that. So that's the end of the piece. What did Birchall have to say in 2009? That's from an interview between Sartre and Cliff. Ian Birchall, a heterodox Marxist trajectory interview with Salim Nadi. Yeah, the book that I'm referring to is Tony Cliff, A Marxist for His Time. I'm probably not going to read that whole thing, but I am I'm very interested in Cliff's theory of state capitalism and how it jives or doesn't jive with other theories of state capitalism and other theories of the USSR. So thanks for listening, and hopefully you got something out of this. I'm actually reading this conclusion before I'm reading the rest of the book, so this might go up before the other ones, but yeah. Thanks for listening.